So welcome to the tutorial on Jasmin Giraffe quilt. This is a nice little wall hanging. It's kind of fun. It's using some very delicious fabrics by Hoffman. It's their Inda Batiks, the Me and You range that they have a division of, and they're quite exciting to use. I'm really thrilled with the way this quilt has come up. So this is going to be a tutorial on all the aspects of how to make it. So I just thought it would be quite nice for you to see the whole thing before we start. So we've got some quilting. We've appliqued and quilted at the same time, and then we've come back and finished quilting the background. We've got a tree that Jasmin is having a little snack on. Jasmin has some lovely dots on her. She's got these raised dots which are quite exciting. They just add a little bit of texture. Those dots are also in the flowers. So primarily free motion stitched, fused raw edge applique. And we've got this wider binding, and we've got a little flange in there as well. So we'll just go through all of the aspects of how the quilt has been made. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the fabrics. So I've already got my fabrics ready to go. So I've cut out already the background and some fabric to go on the back, and also this batting. Now this batting I'm using is a Hobbs fusible batting, so it's a cotton poly, 80-20, 80 cotton, 20 poly. And it's fusible both sides, but only lightly fusible. You can easily reposition it and iron it back in place again. And I've ironed the backing on already, but I haven't ironed the front on, so it doesn't need to be a lot bigger than the front. And when we've cut out, in the instructions, when we've cut out particularly the front piece, but all of the pieces, we've allowed a little bit extra for trimming down later, because what we're going to do is put our pieces together when we've fused all the giraffe on and the leaves and flowers. And then we're going to be stitching through all three layers, so we're pretty much quilting as we go, although we will be quilting in the background as well. So we want things to be a similar size. The backing and batting can be fractionally bigger, but there is an allowance in the cutting for you to trim down about ½ an inch all the way around. So just bear that in mind when you're positioning things as well. It's just a bit bigger. So that's what I'm doing for the background. And then I've already traced my shapes ready for the applique. I haven't ironed them onto anything yet. They're on the fusible, paperback fusible webbing. So you can see that my giraffe's head is all one shape. This is his mane. We've got the leaves and flowers and things here. So there's plenty of things to be going on with there. So to get that, because the giraffe is larger than our pages are that we can print, the pattern is going to look something like this. And there'll be a few extra markings on when you have it in your pattern, so that you can join them up. It'll show you where to join to get the whole shape ready, and it will also be in reverse to this one because you want it around the other way because of the applique. And these dots and things that are marked there where the spots are going to go. And talking of dots, they're going to be using these little plastic buttons. These are called Karimi buttons. They're from Japan, and they're in different sizes. And so we're just going to cover those with fabric, but we'll go through some of that a little bit later. But that's what those are all about. They're all for those nice little spots on the giraffe. And there'll be some circles in your pattern, some shapes for you to use for approximate sizing for the fabric to cover the buttons with. So I think we've covered all that. We'll just have a quick look at these fabrics. So what we're going to do here is I've suggested a fat quarter for the giraffe. Well, that's because he's quite large, and he will fit nicely within a fat quarter, so that you can position him like that on your fabric. And the other pieces are just smaller amounts, because we only need something narrow for the mane. We need something for some of the spots, leaves and things up the top, and then we need something, and also a lighter colour for the spots. But also this is the partly for the flange, which is the narrow little bit that goes around just inside the binding. And then I've got a nice dark one for the binding. So around the edge we're going to have something that looks a little bit like that. We'll see it better later. And then also just a small amount of something fairly pale for the actual flower petals, and also for the eye of the giraffe, which is also made using those Karimi buttons. So now I just need to roughly cut those out, iron them to the wrong side of my fabrics, and I'm using these very delicious Hoffman Inda Batiks. They're particularly nice. They are a batik, but they've got a different form of printing on them, and they're lovely to work with, particularly for this sort of raw edge applique that we're going to be doing. So we can talk a little bit more about that shortly. So now I need to iron these onto the back of my fabrics, cut them out. Make sure you've got some nice scissors. These are really good ones. These have a little serrated blade on one of the blades, and that helps hold your fabrics, and you just get a really nice fine cut. So some nice sharp scissors will be really good for cutting out your applique, because you iron it on, then we cut on the line through the paper and the fabric to get those nice shapes. So I'm going to go away, press my shapes on, and we'll come back and show you some more. Hi, so I thought I'd just show you how I've positioned things. I've already ironed some of my shapes, the flowers and leaves on. I've done a little bit of tracing. I've got one of these wonderful chalk marking pencils. It's like a mechanical pencil, but with a fairly thick sort of chalk lead in it. I find these wonderful because the chalk will just brush away when you've finished using it. You can get finer line ones, but sometimes they're a little bit hard to see on their fabric. So I've actually drawn just roughly where I think that the stems and leaves will go. For the leaves will go there, and I've also drawn on the giraffe here where the ear and any markings, the mouth, eye and things will go on the giraffe. So that's a great little chalk pencil to use. It comes with a little sharpener often and things, so that you can keep it all nice, and sometimes with some different coloured chalks, which is really handy for working on different fabrics. So what we've got here is the giraffe and the mane. So I've cut them all out. I've already ironed the leaf that the giraffe is eating to the mouth there, so that it's in place. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how we pop the mane in. So I've already anchored this to the lower part of my background here, so that I don't lose the position altogether. I've cut the mane out, left it in one piece, but we need the mane to go in behind the ossicone on the front, but in front of the one that goes into the back of the head, the other side of the mane. And the same with the ears. So I've left so that there's just a little bit flapping from the little second bit of the ossicone. It's only a tiny bit, but it does make a difference if things are reasonably accurate when we have everything there. And the same with the ear. So again, I've left it just flapping. The pattern will show you where to cut these little bits so that you can tuck the ear behind the mane that is meant to be behind the mane, but it's not losing its position by leaving it attached. And the same with the little ossicone bit, that can sit behind, and it's just a tiny bit that shows, but that tiny bit will make all the difference. And then I can finish positioning this so that everything's in place. I've got my ironing pad underneath, so I'm about to make good use of that. Make sure the mane is sitting just where you want it, the leaves, everything there, and then we can just iron these shapes in place. And with that chalk marking, that's fine. That will still come off when we're ready for that to come off later on. And my ironing pad's not as big as my giraffe, so we can move that around. So he's all ready now for some stitching. I'm going to free motion stitch on the lines. And so by drawing those lines in with the chalk marker, that will help me with his ears. And the eye is going to be put on separately, but the mouth line, there's a little nostril there, and also the leaves and stems. So I'm going to use a nice dark sort of rusty orange colour for the giraffe. And then I've got a nice green. I'm using these Aurifil threads. The green for all the leaves and stems, something that will stand out against the background, because we'll be doing all the stem work with that as well. But I'm doing all the stitching free motion. The orange I'll also use for the flower petals, because they're going to have nice little yellow centres. So that's that. It now needs to be ironed onto the fusible webbing, the fusible batting, so that and the backing, so that we're working through everything all in one go, so that we're quilting as we go basically. So that's my next step, is to iron it to the batting and the backing, and then I'll start doing some free motion stitching. So I thought I'd show you just how I do a little bit of this free motion stitching. I've done some, as you can see. I'm double stitching the outlines. I like this stronger colour. It's helping to give the little giraffe a little bit of a lift and outline. I'm just going to do one of the ossicones because I've done some little fluffy stuff on the end, just to show you that it's really just playing with the free motion stitching. So I'm just going to start with where I've drawn my line where the ossicone comes into the head. So we start there, a couple of stitches to hold it. And then I'm just outlining fairly close to that edge. way back down, and then I'm going to come back up again, following that line still. But now I want this fluffy stuff, so that's really just playing with the machine. This is kind of fun. It's really, we're just doing some little ziggy-zaggy bits, and we're going to come back again. And that just gives a little bit of texture. And those ossicones have a little bit of hairy bit on them, so that's just to indicate that. I think it looks kind of fun. It's fun to do, and that's how I've done some markings on the ears, some little hairy bits in the ears there. Otherwise I've just double stitched, and I haven't worried if I haven't gone exactly over the stitching. It just helps it give it a nice outline. And with the mouth and the nostril, the same thing. I've just played and filled in that area. Now the eye we leave because we're going to put that on later, and we've got to sew some dots on using those wonderful Karimi buttons. So now I've done pretty much all of this with this red thread, and I'm going to change to the green and start doing the leaves. Oh no, I've got one more flower to do, so I'll just show you the flower here. I've just outlined. Now I've only done a single outline on the flower, and it all looks a little bit messy. But remember, it's going to have a Karimi button sitting over the centre bit there. So I can just quickly go around that flower now just to show you what I've done there, because it's just the little decorative bits. Again, this doesn't have to be absolutely exact. We're just outlining. Bring your petals right into the centre there so that everything's covered with the buttons. I find it easier to go right round the flower first. And then to come back and do these sort of little petal lines. Oops, there's my thread in the way there. Now just remember that your button is going to cover the centre, so you don't have to panic about this too much. Far enough so that they'll be seen when the button's on there. It all looks a little bit untidy perhaps at the moment. However, by the time that whole centre's covered up, that's going to look quite fun as a little blossom flower on there. So that's all the dark stitching done with the dark red, and now I'm going to change to the green and do all my leaves, stems and leaves and everything together there, so that it's just the same sort of thing. And I'm going right the way through the backing as well, so if you use a thread that on the back that more or less matches or blends into your backing. The other thing I hadn't mentioned was that we have allowed about a ½ inch all the way round the whole hanging that can be trimmed down afterwards, so that if things move a little bit, that's not a problem either. So just remember that when you're positioning. You can see I've kind of come up in a little bit here. Plus, as well as that, there is a fairly wide binding. We've got a 1 inch binding and a little flange, so some of the edges get used. So when you're putting things like the leaves and things on, make sure there's enough room for a little bit of trimming, and then a 1 inch binding and flange inside there as well. So other than that, we're back to the free motion stitching. So for the quilting, I'm just doing some free motion, parallel straight-ish lines, but occasionally I'm doing a little circle in there, not too many, and then I've outlined all the applique before I started doing this, just about 1/8 of an inch away from everything, and I have to stop and start when I reach those. So we'll just go through a line so you can see what I'm doing there. So we've finished the quilting, we've trimmed the quilt to the measurements that we want, and there was just enough to trim off a little bit all the way around. Everything's sitting quite nicely. I've got my occasional circles in my quilting. I've stopped and started where I've come up against where I've outlined all the quilting. I've still got a few threads to snip where I've skipped across. That will all happen because I double stitch. When I stop and start, I can just cut those off. And now I'm adding the flange. So this is just a little narrow strip that sits inside the binding, and the binding we're doing is quite wide. It's going to be a 1-inch finished binding. So the flange we've cut as strips, and I've cut them to length, and so I had the strip first, I've folded it in half, and then I've cut it to length. So I've already sewn 3 sides on, and I did these exactly the same way. I want it to be the same length as my finished item because I don't want it to be wandering around growing or shrinking or stretching or anything. So I like to do things the same length as I'm after, and then I can start sewing it along here. Because we're only going to have about 1/4 of an inch or so of this showing, then we can sew it further in. Now I haven't sewn all the way in, but maybe at about 5/8 of an inch in. So I've got the walking foot on to do this bit because we're going through the thicknesses, and I just thought it would all sit better. And I'm using the sole plate, this plate here, which has markings on it, as my guide. So there's one here that says 5/8 of an inch. So I'm just running the edge of my fabric so that it sits against that marker, so that I know I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch away, which is just an approximate amount at the moment, but it's quite helpful to have those little guides there. So I just like to let that go through, staying on that 5/8 line, and then we'll have our flange on. And this is the last side, so it'll be all ready for the binding next. We come back and do the dots and the eye and things after it's all finished. So now we're up to the binding. We've got all this flange sewn on. It's sitting nicely, but we have to bind it. So because we're going to do a 1-inch binding, which is quite a lot wider than we normally do, I've suggested that we cut the binding strips quite wide, so they're 5.5 inches cut, so that we can bind it around. And for those of you who know me, you'll know that normally I machine my bindings onto the back and roll them to the front and machine them down, but surprise, surprise, this time I'm doing it around the other way. So I'm going to start off as I normally do with my folded corner, and I'm going to start sewing in here and stopping when I get to the end of the folded bit, and then leaving a gap and starting just the same as I do my normal binding, but I am sewing it to the front because I will be rolling it this time to the back and actually hand stitching that down. With a wider binding, it is probably a little bit easier to get it to sit correctly. Otherwise, just the same. So I'm going to be stitching it this time like we used the 5/8 measurement on our sewing machine to sew the flange on. With the binding, because I only want 1/4 of an inch of this flange to show, then I'm going to stitch at 1 inch in from the edge. So 1 inch in from the edge, certainly on my machine, you may want to check it on your machine, is actually the edge of the metal plate. So I can just line that up with my fabric and sew that on. So I'll show you how I do the corners, because they're much the same, but everything's just bigger this time. So we have to stop 1 inch before the corner, turn, fold, and all those sorts of things that we normally do. But I will show you how I'm doing that as we go. So working with the wider binding, it's just the same, just bigger. So I've started here with my little point turned down. I've left a little gap there for tucking in when I get around there. It does all seem a little cumbersome. Some people I know prefer to press their bindings in half before they start. I prefer to fold mine as I go, and the idea is that when we fold that back, we'll see just that nice piece of the flange, that little bit of colour just there. And when we fold it back, we're going to see that it just comes over quite nicely, and that'll be hand slip stitched down in place. So coming up to the corner, normally we're just sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because I'm using a 1 inch seam allowance, we stop 1 inch before the end. And yes, I did pop a little pin in. You can mark it so that you stop at the right place. And then we take it out and we fold it just the same as we do with the smaller amount. Press that so that it's going right out through the corner. Fold it back over again. And then we can just start stitching right at the end again, just like we normally do, but we're using the 1 inch seam allowance, and that'll give us that little foldy bit, so that'll give us the nice mitre in the corner. So not hard, just large. So I'm just doing my last corner, and then I've got to tuck in to the little bit where I started. So I just thought I'd show you how I'm doing that. So I've gone all the way around. I've done my other corners, so they've got these nice flappy bits which will allow us to mitre, and I've got this one ready to start sewing from the end, and then I'll just show you how I tuck that last little bit in. So still with our 1 inch seam here, and I'm just lining it up with the edge of my plate there. So I've already cut off the end of my binding, because I know that I'm going to be tucking it in to this little bit here. So I just tuck that in so that everything sits as nice and firm as it can. The edges should sit fairly even, and then I just continue stitching till I meet up with my stitching where I started. Now, there are other ways of doing a binding, even a wide binding like this. However, I've left it so that we've got all this extra fabric in the binding, because I just thought it would give it a better frame. It's just a very lightweight wall hanging, and I just thought that might sit nicely. It just gives it a bit of solid edges, which I just thought would be helpful. So that's all gone in now. Because this is quite a large area here to deal with, when I slip stitch the binding over to the back of the quilt, I will also catch that down as well, because that's a little bit large to leave open like that. The other thing, when you're putting your binding on at this stage, or you can do it at another stage if you prefer, is to pop a sleeve on, a hanging sleeve. So I've done that. I like to double mine over, and I include it in that top row of stitching quite often. So I've just stitched it in at the 5/8 inch level, and then I'm going to come along and hand slip stitch that down so that I can pop a hanging rod in there as well. So that's always a nice thing when it's a wall hanging, to be able to hang it from something. So now I'm ready to do all my hand stitching. I can turn that over. When you fold these little mitres, the corners, you'll see that you can tuck that around, and this little bit here will tuck around so that you get the nice, oops, probably all you can see is my hand, so that you can fold that over on the back nicely into a mitre, and what that will give you on the front is a very nicely mitred corner, and I can show you those when I've finished. So after doing the hand stitching for that, then I need to do something about the eye, and also the little buttons for the spots and the flower centres. If your markings are disappearing on the eye, use your chalk pencil and just keep putting them in, because with just handling they will disappear, but it's very easy just to remark them before they completely disappear. So that'll be the next stage. So I still haven't quite finished all my binding, but that's okay. I wanted to pop the eyelid on next, so the pattern has a shape for you to cut. When you cut it, make sure that this bit that's going across here is on the bias, because we want that to be just a little bit stretchy, and also to cut the slit just in one side so that we can turn that through the slit, because we're going to fold that over so that that's a little bit stretchy there, and we're just going to stitch just a small seam around there and then turn it through the little slit that we've made there. So I'll just quickly do that and then show you how we do the rest of it. It's a little bit fiddly, but it's kind of worth it to make that eye stand out nicely. So the eye ball itself is using the Karimi buttons, which we'll do a little bit later, but we can get this bit on because we're machining this. Well, I'm machining mine. So I've done just a narrow seam allowance. I'm going to turn that out the right way now, and then I'll give that a quick press. And then we can do, so the eyelashes could either be hand stitched, hand embroidered, or they could be done by machine. So I'll do it by machine to show you how I do that. But they would be just as good to do by hand if you like to hand embroider eyelashes. So there's a couple of reasons for having the bias and the slit like that. Obviously the slit so that we can turn it out the right way, but we also want to just be able to manipulate it a little bit, and if it's on the bias it's a little bit stretchy, and so we can do that as well. So I'm just going to press that now pretty much as is, but not that folded edge, just where we've sewn. And so if I turn it to the wrong side, which is the one with the slit on it, if we now just bring that a little bit in, it just allows us to pull that a little bit of a shaping, just to get a little bit of a curve going on that edge there. So that it's just going to scoop over the eyeballs quite nicely. So it's not a big curve, but it's certainly allowed us to do some sort of shaping there. So that's quite good like that. And then I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch those eyelashes on. So I'm just going to stitch a line across here, and I'm using that dark red thread again that we used to outline applique, and I'll just do some little eyelashes on there. But the last one won't get done now because that will be done as we machine it onto the giraffe. So I've got some nice lashes curling up there. Now if your markings have disappeared, and mine have partially disappeared, you just kind of need to know more or less where that eyelid's going. The eyeballs we're going to pop in a bit later, but we've now got this nicely shaped thing. It's got a nice little curve going on. So we've got those eyelashes going up the right way, and so because I've got some markings here, I can position this on. So I want to position it so that the front point is obviously at the front, and the back point. Now we've got to make sure that there's a bit of curve going on here, a bit of opening, because we've got those eyeballs to sit in underneath, which will be the Karimi buttons. So we just need to ease this in a little bit. Again, you could sew this on by hand. I'm going to do it on the machine. Just make sure that it's sitting up. You don't want it sitting quite tight flat, because we've got to fit those Karimi buttons in there. So I'm going to go back to the sewing machine now and just stitch along this top edge to hold that eyelid in place. So I'm going to start at the front corner. And like we did our applique, just close to that edge. Just going to do a little back stitch. I'll probably only need to do this line of sewing the once. Just make sure that we're keeping a little bit of bulge in our eyelid. So just take your time just stitch around, just trying to keep that little bit of fullness in there. And I think that's looking pretty good. Now, because we've done those eyelashes, we've still got one eyelash to go just sitting on there. So I think I'm going to just back up just a tiny touch here. And then I'm going to do an eyelash coming onto the face there. That's that final lash. And again, we've got to go over that a couple of times. Just to give it a bit of definition. And I think we've got a pretty good eyelid going on there, so there's a nice little bit of space in there for our little creamy buttons. Got some eyelashes going on. I'm pretty pleased with that little eyelid. So I thought I'd show you how to cover these creamy buttons. As you can see, they come in various sizes. I'm going to show you on one of the larger ones because that'll be easier for you to see, but the technique is the same for all of them. They come from Japan, these buttons. They're rather delicious to use. They add a little bit of texture. So we've cut out in your pattern, you will have had some suggested circle sizes to cut your fabrics out of, and it's larger than your button obviously because we're just doing a running thread around the edge to gather it in. So I've almost finished going around this. Now I'm using a double thread because I wanted it to be nice and strong, and I started off knotting the end, but I've left the end hanging quite long because I'm going to leave the ends hanging long so that we can actually use those threads to stitch the buttons in place when they're all done. So I've come all the way around there. I'm just going to tie that first part of the knot now because I find I need an extra hand that I don't have, and we can start to pull that up a little bit into a little bit of a cup. Then we pop the rounded dome side down in the middle there, and then we can draw this up nice and tight. And because we've done that first part of the knot, and if you happen to have an extra hand around with you, that would be really awesome. However, we'll have to make do with my fingers today. And then I'm just going to tie another knot just to hold that. So you've got to keep that thread pressed down on the first knot that we've tied, and it all probably looks a little bit awkward, which it is, because I've only got two hands, not several. And that's pulled up nice and tight now, so that's a nice smooth dome. You won't see all this all gets covered up, but I'm leaving my threads nice and long, and also because I popped the knot in the end, it was partly so I couldn't lose it, but also it keeps those ends together for when you're tying knots and things, which does make it a whole lot easier. So there's several different sizes. I've covered a few. I haven't finished doing them all yet, and these are going to be going on the giraffe's neck primarily, although also these flowers, they have a center. I've already done one there. I've got another one to go on there, and we probably don't need that needle, and it's going to attach itself to me because that's what they do. And so when we're doing the eye, so we've already done the eyelid, it's sitting like a little lifted up eyelid because that's what eyelids do. We need to do the eye. Now the eye is also done with the Karimi buttons with a couple of sizes. I've already put the eye together, so there's a dark one on a light one, like a little eyeball, and the dark one is not in the center, it's slightly to one side, because then we're going to pop that in under that eyelid so that it's just sitting something like that. I'm not so good when I'm upside down. Hopefully you can see that. And then the other dots, we've got the flowers, we've got the eyes, and then down the giraffe's neck we've got these other dots to go on. And on your pattern you'll have some sort of a guide on your pattern piece that will give you a rough idea of where to put some of the shapes. You can rearrange them however you like, of course, because It's fairly random. Now I've got all my threads still hanging because I haven't stitched them on yet, but they'll be coming all the way up the neck. I just haven't finished covering them all yet. So you can see that this giraffe is coming together quite nicely, and can now see what's going on in life and is very excited about that. So I've been very busy finishing off my giraffe. I've got here the giraffe wall hanging pretty much complete now. We've got all our quilting done, we've got all our little dots all stitched in place for the flowers and on the giraffe neck and his eye, or her eye, because this is Jasmin Giraffe, and I'm pretty pleased with that. We've got that wide binding on. I've hand stitched all my binding down, which is unusual for me, but I felt that with that wider binding and the flange it was easier to control that way. I've got my hanging sleeve on, I've slip stitched that down, ready to stick a pole in it, and pretty much that's it. That is Jasmin Giraffe.